中国真的陷入日本式的通货紧缩，美国很高兴，台湾很多反对中国大陆的人也会很高兴。但是从经济的角度来讲，如果我们给大家一个数字，中国的现在的制造业，它的产值占全球的31%，它的商品出口占全球的14%，它的市场里头有4亿的中等收入的群体的国家，它的消费力因此下降的话，答案是什么？就全球没有人是赢家。它输出的通货紧缩将会影响全世界的经济发展。它本身的购买力下降，现在所有小到 iPhone， 大到奢侈品牌 LV、Dior 这些东西全部都出现了营收衰退的一个状况。所以这个东西已经无关于你对于这个国家你喜欢或不喜欢。美国跟台湾可能高兴，可是你可能也要小心，台湾自己出口的中国大陆的东西，它的出口订单也会下降，而也要小心它所带来的全球互相流动式的一个影响，那拖累了全球的经济增长。所以中国的经济呢，是否正如日本，将因为它的输出通货紧缩冲击全球的经济，甚至消失5年到10年。它不是一个你讨不讨厌中国，你喜不喜欢中国的问题，而是全球经济未来一个重大的风险。
This is the story of China's historic economic slowdown and what the end of its decades-long boom means for the rest of Asia.The most dynamic region of the global economy. It became the year China's entire model of debt-fueled growth ran out of steam. The economy is now teetering under the weight of a creaking property market and collapsed consumer demand. And all that's undermined Beijing's long-term growth ambitions too.
This is a chart showing the change in consumer prices in China. As you can see, those prices have been falling a lot.Many economists are concerned that China is slipping into a period of deflation.
当14亿人口是以中等收入群体陷入集体的消费紧缩，需求不足时。
There's no question that China is in deflation. The question is, how long is it going to last? And will it become entrenched in people's expectations? Because what we know about deflation is that if people really believe that they're in a state of deflation for some time, the first thing they're going to do is stop consuming and start saving. Once people save, they're going to start.to wonder, will prices continue to go down so that it's worthwhile for me to not spend until prices bottom out?
正在中国发现新大陆，一度把这视为最大海外市场的国际品牌，不论是奢侈品 LV、迪奥，或是苹果手机，都出现销售增长乏力，甚至营收衰退。
Lower spending means that companies make less profit.That means they need less workers, so unemployment might go up. Spending gets even lower, prices fall further. So you get into this sort of vicious circle where prices and spending just sort of chase each other lower.
与中国内需市场萎靡同样显而易见的，还有中国的进口。
Throughout 2023, China's foreign trade has slumped. And according to IMF statistics, 7 Asian economies that count Beijing as their largest trading partner will have lower GDP growth this year compared to last.With 6 of those seeing growth slow by at least 1%. That includes economies like Korea and Taiwan, which depend on China for their tech exports.
Their channel of growth from China is exports, and exports are falling. So clearly, the current situation is very different from the past, where China's imports were growing at 20%, 30% at some point.
且不只是贸易。中国的对外投资也在下降。尽管北京在去年10月风光举行了一带一路倡议10周年峰会，但中国对一带一路的投资规模从2018年的高峰以来已下降了近1半。
Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, even Indonesia is dependent to a great extent on Chinese financing of investment. Chinese money is technically available with no strings attached. What will happen if that does not come through?Then
finally, we have the hit to tourism. Asian countries were already reeling when Chinese tourists stopped traveling because of the pandemic. But with Chinese purse strings tight, foreign travel is yet to return to pre-pandemic levels. Thailand has even offered Chinese visa-free entry to entice them back.
There are entire regions in Indonesia, Manado, in Sulawesi, for example, where the entire tourism sector is built on the proposition of receiving hundreds of thousands of Chinese tourists every year. And if that slows down because of a slowdown, then the Asian growth story is going to turn sour. There's no other way of looking at it.
但这只是关于中国经济放缓故事的一半。
For years now, American politics has been shaped by the idea of the China shock. The term, coined by 3 economists in a 2016 paper, captures the widespread belief that trade with China has resulted in the deindustrialization of significant parts of the U.S. and the loss of huge numbers of manufacturing jobs.
华尔街日报就指出，如今这场中国冲击换了一种形式，卷土重来。
Deflation in China isn't just a problem for China, it's also a problem for the rest of the world. Weak consumer spending in China means exporters have to ship goods overseas to find buyers, and that's led to the price of Chinese exports falling too. While cheaper prices are good for consumers, they're putting pressure on domestic manufacturers around the world because China can produce a lot of goods more cheaply.
In Europe, for instance, there's a lot of anxiety at the moment over automakers. So Chinese companies are making a lot of cars, a lot of electric vehicles in particular, and they're making them cheaply and they're selling them all over the world.
相比20年前，中国在全球制造业份额不到10%，出口不到5%。如今，中国制造业产值占全球31%，商品出口占全球的44%。华尔街日报认为，这次的中国冲击将比过去20多年来的情况更加严重。首先，这次中国因通缩造成产能过剩的廉价商品输出，将包括低端制造到高端的战略产业。
In response, countries like the U.S. are imposing trade barriers against Chinese exports.
华尔街日报指出，新的中国冲击将掀起新一波的贸易保护主义，如欧美已准备就中国出口的电动车等进行反补贴与关税壁垒措施，以保护本国产业。但如成熟制成的晶片，将难免在国际上引发一场价格战的厮杀，首当其冲的是南韩与台湾。此外，这次便宜的中国制造将对众多新兴经济体羽翼未丰的产业，在与中国的竞争中萎靡甚至消失，就像美国在早期经历的那样。而中国海关最新的数据显示，今年1月至2月的出口同比增长7.1%，远高于市场预期的3%。这虽然提振中国稳经济的信心，同时也加大了贸易紧张局势升温的可能性。而即便中国官方否认中国经济将走入日本式的通缩，但全球经济正为中国通缩的输出严阵以待。
They're very familiar with what happened in Japan and are determined to avoid it. Whether they're taking the right lessons from it, I think, is uncertain. Japan, when it entered into deflation and stagnation, was the second largest economy in the world. China is the world's second largest economy, and to have that slide into deflation and stagnation would mean lower global growth overall. So it definitely is a problem for the rest of the world.
而当前的美中科技战也为中国与全球经济带来新的问题。彭博社报道，美国正拉拢盟国，进一步限制中国半导体技术发展，这让科技战的小院高墙愈筑越高。华尔街日报本周则披露一份中国国资委在2022年下发的79号文件，要求在国际系统内的软硬体设备进行本土技术产品替代美国产品的销 A 行动。这是习近平强调科技自力更生的实践，对美国科技企业来说，无疑将失去原本在中国市场的一席之地。而美中科技战造就红色供应链崛起，更可能改变当前全球贸易的格局。
收看今天文茜的世界周报欧洲版，在进入欧洲相关的议题之前，我们先来谈一下台海风险。台海风险最高峰被讨论的时间点是2022，接着到2023年，美国每一年的3月都有在参议院跟众议院的称之为叫情报委员会，这个情报委员会里头呢，就会举行情报听证会，从中情局局长、情报总监各个主要的人通通都会坐在那里。2023年3月的时候，当时中情局局长或者是情报总监海恩斯都和2022年的说法完全改口。2022年的说法是2027年中国准备攻打台湾，甚至数个月到1年之内。2023年的3月的说法是，中国目前没有武力攻打台湾的打算，只有当和平方案不可行的时刻，中国才会考虑使用武力。这是海恩斯情报总监，而中情局局长 William Burns 则直接改口说，他认为10年之后台海才可能会有风险。他说这句话跟他上一次说几个月到1年之前的时间相差只有4个月。而现在美国总统大选到了，3月也到了，美国的参众议院再次的召开了情报听证会。情报听证会里头，台海议题又浮上台面。浮上台面之后，又来了2027年之前中共就可能会攻打台湾的说法。美国的国家情报总监海恩斯的说法说，北京将继续利用军事力量恐吓其邻国。我们预计解放军将部署更先进的平台，部署新技术，并增强联合作战能力，特别是聚焦在台湾和西太平洋地区。当然他们也提到最近金厦地区，中国把金门跟厦门这个地方变成内海化，那这就是一个警告。所以呢，台海问题再度又成了美国的一个重大的危险地区，跟2023年的3月隔1年又不一样了。美国的有线电视网因此就针对他们所说的2027年可能爆发战争，台海到底有多危险，制作了一个专题。我们不能不了解我们所居住的地方，在美国人的眼中如何一会儿有危险，一会儿没有危险，现在就有我的危险。我们来看一下 CNN 的专题报道。
A war over Taiwan would be an act of madness. Tens of thousands could die.
Nearly 1.2 million jobs have disappeared.
There could be a global Great Depression. Nuclear weapons would be on the table. An attack would be a massive gamble for China's Communist Party. It could risk losing the party's grip on power. But China appears to be preparing for its D-Day. Its leader Xi Jinping has said he seeks a peaceful reunion. But he wants his military ready to invade, if necessary, within 3 years, according to U.S. intelligence. Why would China risk everything and throw the world into turmoil over an island less than 1% of its size?
回想1972年毛泽东和尼克森季辛吉签订《上海公报》时，毛泽东曾经对台湾问题提出100年搁置的建议，避免美中一战，也换来了美国同意一个中国政策，并且附上反对台独、反对两国论、反对一中一台的密约承诺。
In a conversation with Henry Kissinger in the 1970s, China's leader Mao Zedong said he could live without Taiwan for now. But in 100 years, we will want it, he said. And what's more, we are going to fight for it.
在上海公报之后52年，全球局势巨变，台湾问题等不到下一个50年。在讨论中共会不会打过来之前，华盛顿邮报专栏作家扎卡利亚说：“你必须先看清楚美中台长久以来错综复杂的关系。”
One of the war's most historic meetings.
America's relationship with Taiwan had been complicated. It had bankrolled Chiang Kai-shek in the Civil War, then turned its back on him after he lost, and planned to abandon him if Mao invaded. But in June of 1950,
we are fighting in Korea for our own national security and survival.
Communist North Korea invaded South Korea, and neighboring Taiwan became a crucial Cold War player.
时任美国总统杜鲁门甚至派遣美军舰队进入台湾海峡。
And America backed Taiwan as the only legitimate government of China.
怎奈好景不长。
But by the 1970s, times were changing. America was losing a war in Vietnam.
Get the machine guns up here!
And President Richard Nixon needed a new Cold War strategy.
The greatest threat to the United States was not China, it was the Soviet Union.
于是，在1971年，尼克森派时任美国总统国家安全事务助理基辛格密访北京。隔年，时任美国总统尼克森访问中国。这次历史性访问最终导致1979年美国与中华人民共和国建交，不再承认中华民国为中国合法政府。
Meanwhile, at the United Nations, Mao's China was invited in, while Chiang Kai-shek's Taiwan was forced out.
1975年，蒋中正逝世，失去美国支持的台湾在国际上孤立无援。
Chiang's son, Chiang Ching-kuo, took over and pursued a bold new strategy to move Taiwan toward democracy in order to save it.
He knew that the future of Taiwan would depend on support of the U.S. But how do you build up American support? You have to be really democratic.
1987年，蒋经国明令解严。1996年，台湾实现第一次总统民选，成为世界上第一个真正民主的华人国家。但是当时的台湾政府已经意识到，这张民主牌不能保护台湾多久。
China shook the world, detonating its first nuclear bomb in 1964. Meanwhile, a bloody war in Vietnam had America considering a retreat in Asia.
When Richard Nixon was elected, he gave a very prominent speech talking about having Asian allies and partners stand up for their own defense rather than relying on the United States. If you were sitting in Taiwan, that made you very, very nervous.
Taiwan desperately needed a way to keep its powerful ally on board. The solution? Link Taiwan's economy much more closely to America's, to give the U.S. more skin in the game. The microchip. Our lives run on semiconductors.
而张忠谋就是那位创造出护国法宝的人。
Its government asked him to lead not just one company, but to lead Taiwan's entire chip industry. It was an offer he couldn't refuse. Chiang's approach was a massive gamble.
At the time, it was a crazy idea because there were no companies that existed that only designed chips.
But Chiang was determined. In 1987, he founded the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, or TSMC.
It would give birth to a series of other startups that wouldn't have to invest in factories, wouldn't have to invest in equipment, could only do the design and rely on him to manufacture.
And nobody makes them better than Taiwan. Over 60% of the world's chips come from this small island, and 90% of the most advanced chips are made by just one company, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
即使是中国，2020年有70%的晶片来自台积电。
Some believe TSMC isn't a target on Taiwan, but a silicon shield over it.
理性来看，中国攻台将导致晶片生产停摆，损害中国自身经济。
中国共产党 For Xi Jinping, that might be a risk worth taking.
For China, it's not just about chips. It's about unification. That is part of their basic ethos.
And finally, some of my own thoughts on this subject. China has never accepted that Taiwan can be an independent country. Every leader, beginning with Mao Zedong, has affirmed the goal of reunifying the two. But in the past, Communist China believed that it could wait because time was on its side. Eventually, the mainland, with its massive economy and billion-plus population, would draw the tiny island of 24 million into its orbit. That was the thinking. But that premise is proving untrue. Taiwan has developed into a feisty democracy with a political culture defined by its political system and in stark contrast to China. Over the past few decades, Taiwan has gotten more determined not to reunify with China. So, Xi Jinping must look at the situation and feel time is not on his side. Perhaps it would be better to act sooner than later. Most people in Taiwan simply want to maintain the status quo and keep things going as they are. What does all this mean? That this issue will need to be managed rather than solved, and managed very carefully, both by Beijing and Washington. This is the one place on earth where there should be little room for macho rhetoric and provocative actions. All three sides should keep talking to ensure no misperceptions or miscalculations. Deterring China from invasion is crucial, but persuading Taiwan to avoid needless provocation is also important. Washington should be careful not to needlessly provoke China as well. None of this is morally satisfying, but the stakes are high enough that one thing is clear. Were these tensions to be mismanaged, were this conflict to turn into war, it would be a lose-lose-lose for all three parties. Indeed, the whole world would suffer cataclysmic consequences. Better to kick the can down the road as long as possible and hope it doesn't explode.